Sergeant Ryan Cole grabbed the briefing sheet, looked at her name, and laughed out loud. Not a polite chuckle, a full open-mouthed laugh that echoed across the barracks. He held the paper up so everyone could see it. "They sent us a girl," he said like it was the punchline to a joke nobody asked for. "A girl. To teach us." The room erupted, and she was standing right there when he said it. She heard every word. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She just watched him laugh, and somewhere behind those calm, steady eyes, something was already being decided. If this story already has your blood pressure rising, you are not alone. Drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe that real warriors are never what people expect, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end, because what happens over the next 5 days at Fort Bragg will change the way you think about strength, silence, and who gets the last word. She arrived on a Tuesday. No announcement, no escort, no one waiting at the gate with a welcome packet or a handshake. Just a single duffel bag slung over one shoulder, a transfer order tucked under her arm, and a pair of boots that had clearly seen more ground than anyone in that building would have guessed by looking at her face. Commander Olivia Hayes, 27 years old, United States Navy, walked into Fort Bragg's Advanced Combat Training Facility the same way she walked into every room that had ever tried to contain her. Quietly, deliberately, with the kind of stillness that some people mistake for shyness, and others, the wiser ones, recognize immediately as control. She signed in at the front desk. The clerk looked at her paperwork, looked at her, looked back at her paperwork, and said nothing. He processed her file, handed her a room assignment, and watched her walk away. 48 hours later, everyone on base had an opinion about her. None of them were close to the truth. The Advanced Combat Instructor course at Fort Bragg was not a place you stumbled into. It was not a reward. It was not a promotion gift or a participation gesture or something you received because someone in an office thought diversity on paper looked better than substance on the field. Every candidate who walked through those doors had earned their place through years of documented performance, evaluated and reevaluated by people who had no patience for mediocrity and even less tolerance for mistakes. That was the reputation of the program. That was what the candidates believed about themselves and about each other. So when Olivia Hayes showed up with a transfer file that contained almost nothing they could verify, no combat record anyone could pull, no mission history that was publicly accessible, no list of instructors who could vouch for her in a way that satisfied the men who were already there. The conclusion those men reached was fast and it was firm. She did not belong. The question was not whether she was qualified. In their minds, that question had already been answered. The question they were actually asking, the one that hummed underneath every glance and every hushed conversation in the hallway, was who had made a mistake and how quickly could it be corrected. Major Daniel Whitmore was the first to say it out loud. I was not a cruel man. He was not the kind of person who took pleasure in tearing people down for sport. But he had spent 22 years in the United States Marine Corps building a philosophy about what warriors looked like, where they came from, what they were made of. He had trained men who went on to become legends in classified circles that most people would never hear about. He had failed men who looked perfect on paper and turned out to be hollow under pressure. He had learned through 2 decades of blood and repetition and hard lessons in places that didn't make the news that he could read a person within minutes of watching them move. And when he watched Olivia Hayes move through the facility on her first morning, he read her wrong, completely, catastrophically, fundamentally wrong. He didn't know that yet. She was standing near the equipment room when he first addressed her directly. He walked up with his clipboard, gave her the kind of look that was supposed to communicate hierarchy without requiring words, and said, "Hayes, you're Navy?" "Yes, sir," she said. "SEAL program?" "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they are being polite, but are not actually processing new information, when they have already made up their mind and are simply going through the motions of conversation. "And they sent you here specifically for the instructor development track." "That's correct, sir." He looked at his clipboard. He looked at her. He said, "Well, we'll see how you do." 3 words, "We'll see." And the way he said them, calm and flat, and carrying the quiet weight of absolute skepticism, told her everything she needed to know about what the next several days were going to look like. She thanked him and walked away. She did not argue. She did not explain herself. She did not volunteer any of the information that would have changed his assessment of her instantly. Later, people would ask her why. Why didn't she say something that first morning? Why didn't she show them her real file? Why didn't she walk into that room and establish herself on day one so she wouldn't spend the next 4 days absorbing the kind of dismissal that would have broken someone? With less experience, her answer was always the same. Because I needed to know who they really were before they knew who I really was. The barracks were divided by rank and unit, but the real division happened during meals and during the informal hours after formal training sessions ended. That was when the candidates gathered, when the conversations became honest, when you found out what someone actually thought versus what they said in front of instructors. Olivia ate alone her first 2 nights, not because she was excluded from every table. She was not. People made space. People said hello. Basic courtesy existed. But the conversations stopped just slightly whenever she sat down, and they resumed in a different register, filtered, careful, polite, in a way that was its own kind of exclusion. Sergeant First Class Ryan Cole was 29 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, and had been the undisputed best fighter in the group before Olivia arrived. This was not a rumor. This was something he had demonstrated repeatedly and something the other candidates accepted without resentment because it was earned. He was fast, he was strong, and he had the kind of confidence that came from having been tested and having passed. I was also the person who set the tone for how the group treated newcomers. Not because he was mean, because he was the standard. If Ryan Cole respected you, the others followed. If Ryan Cole questioned you, the others looked twice. And Ryan Cole had questions about Olivia Hayes from the moment she arrived. He asked her directly the second evening as she was walking back from the equipment room. He didn't stop walking when he said it just fell into step beside her for a few seconds, casual like it was nothing. So what's your background actually, he said. What did you do before this? A few different things, she said. Combat experience. Some. Instructor experience. Some of that too. He glanced at her sideways. You know this is the advanced track, right? Not the introductory course. She looked at him. Steady. Not cold, not amused, not defensive. Just steady. I know, she said. He waited like he expected to say more. She didn't. He nodded once, said, all right then, and walked in a different direction. That night in the common area, she overheard him talking to 3 other candidates. Corporals Diaz and Trent, in a big quiet southerner everyone called Stonewall. She wasn't hiding. She was sitting 12 feet away reading a manual. They weren't whispering because they weren't particularly concerned about whether she heard. She's not going to last the week, Cole said. I'm not being harsh. I'm being honest. This course chews up guys who've been preparing for it for years. She shows up with a file no one can read and expects to keep up. That's not how this works. Maybe she's better than she looks, Diaz said. Maybe, Cole said, but I doubt it. Stonewall said nothing, just looked in Olivia's direction for a moment, then back at his coffee. She kept reading. She turned a page. She did not react because reacting was exactly what that moment was designed to produce. It was a test disguised as a conversation, the kind of social pressure that weeds out candidates who are emotionally unstable, who are easily rattled, who cannot maintain composure when the environment becomes hostile. She had been through tests that made this conversation look like a warm invitation. She had been in rooms where the hostility was not verbal and the stakes were not about reputation. She turned another page, but she filed every word away. Not out of bitterness, out of precision. She was building a map of this place. A map of who these people were when they thought they were only talking to themselves. The first formal training session of the week happened at 6 in the morning on day 2. It was a joint assessment session where candidates worked in rotating pairs through a series of combat readiness drills. The drills were designed to evaluate technique, reaction speed, and situational decision-making under pressure. They were not gentle. They were not symbolic. People got hurt in these sessions, minor injuries mostly, but the pain was real and the instructors watched the response to pain as carefully as they watched the technique itself. Olivia was paired first with a candidate named Marcus Webb, a former Army Ranger who was built like a door and who had been politely confused about her presence from the start. He was not the kind of person who was rude about it. He simply seemed genuinely uncertain about how to calibrate his effort against someone who in his assessment was unlikely to match him. They faced each other in the drill circle. Whitmore called the start. Webb moved in with controlled, measured force, textbook aggressive. He was good. He was clearly very good. He knew what he was doing, and he did it with the efficiency of someone who had done it thousands of times. Olivia lost that exchange. She was too slow in her pivot. Webb got inside her guard, and she hit the mat. She got up. They reset. She lost again, a different mistake, a weight shift that came half a second too late. Whitmore watched, said nothing, but there was something in his jaw, the faintest tightening that said everything. What happened in the next pairing against Trent was almost identical. She lost cleanly, made errors that were visible and repeatable. Trent did not gloat to his credit, but he did catch Cole's eye across the circle, and the look that passed between them was the look of people watching a theory confirmed. That evening, during the debrief, Whitmore pulled her aside. Hayes, he said, his voice carrying the specific kind of patience that is actually a form of disappointment. What are you looking to get out of this course? I want to learn everything I can from it, she said. You're going to need to move faster, he said. The partners you're working with are not going to slow down for you. That's not how this program operates. I understand, sir. Do you? He looked at her squarely. Because what I saw today was someone who is not at the level this course requires. I don't know what the Navy told you or what your file says, but I'm telling you what I see. And what I see concerns me. She held his gaze. I appreciate the honesty, sir. He nodded, apparently satisfied with that answer, and walked away. She stood there alone for 2 seconds after he left. Then she walked back to her room. She did not call anyone. She did not vent. She sat on the edge of her bunk in the quiet, and she thought about what she had seen that day. Not what had been done to her, but what she had observed. The patterns, the tendencies, the habits these men had developed through years of training in a specific system that had made them very good at a very particular kind of fighting and had simultaneously made them predictable in ways they could not see themselves. Webb favored his right side when he closed distance, every time. She had let him hit that move cleanly in both exchanges, and she had felt exactly how he did it and how he would do it again if she set up the same entry. Trent telegraphed his grapple attempt with his left shoulder, a fractional movement barely visible but consistent. She had confirmed it in both rounds. Cole she had not yet worked with directly, but she had watched him in 3 separate exchanges with other candidates, and she had seen something that she suspected he did not know about himself. When he was in a position of clear dominance, when he was winning easily, he relaxed his defensive awareness. Not because he was careless, because he had been in dominant positions so often that his nervous system had learned to expect them to hold. He had trained himself into a very specific kind of blind spot. She wrote none of this down. She kept it in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. Then she got up, changed into her training clothes, and went out to the back section of the facility where the auxiliary training area was mostly empty at that hour. She trained alone until 11 o'clock. Nobody saw her, or almost nobody. There was one person. Captain Rebecca Monroe had been at Fort Bragg for 3 weeks as a civilian consultant, a retired Navy combat instructor who had been brought in to evaluate the program's methodology for a review being conducted at a higher level. She was 51 years old, had 30 years of military training behind her, and had spent enough time around elite fighters to have developed what she privately called her pattern recognition. The ability to watch someone move and understand, in the way you understand something before you can explain it, what level of training you were actually looking at. She had been watching Olivia Hayes for 2 days. She had been watching her lose those training sessions with the focused attention of someone who suspected the losses were not entirely what they appeared to be. She had noticed things that the other instructors had not noticed because the other instructors were watching what Olivia lost and Rebecca Monroe was watching how. The how told a completely different story. When Webb got inside Olivia's guard and took her to the mat, her fall was controlled. Not a controlled fall in the sense of someone who had been taught how to fall safely, which every combat trainee learns. A controlled fall in the sense of someone who had chosen the angle of descent, had maintained positional awareness through the entire sequence, and had landed in a way that would have allowed immediate re-engagement at a speed Webb would not have expected. She had not re-engaged. She had stayed down and reset. But the fall itself was wrong for someone who was actually caught off guard. That was not how losing looked. That was how choosing to lose looked. Rebecca Monroe went to the auxiliary training area at 9:45 that evening because she had a strong feeling about what she was going to find. She stood in the doorway for 4 minutes watching Olivia work through a sequence against a striking pad she had mounted on a stand. She watched the movement, the speed, the precision, then she understood completely. She stepped inside. Olivia stopped, turned. She had heard Rebecca come in, of course. The only question was whether Rebecca had seen enough. By the look on Rebecca's face, she had seen more than enough. "How long?" Rebecca asked. "How long what, ma'am? How long have you been doing this?" Olivia considered the question for a moment, the way someone considers how honest to be when honesty might cost them something. Then she said, "Since I was 19. Rebecca walked closer. She looked at the way Olivia was standing, the precise balance, the stillness in her core, the positioning of her hands. "Who trained you?" Olivia didn't answer immediately. Rebecca said, "I'm not asking so I can tell anyone. I'm asking because I've trained a lot of people in my life, and I know what elite close-quarter instruction looks like when it shows up in someone's body. And you have it, all of it. Things that take most people a decade to even begin to understand, and you move like they're already part of your nervous system. So I'm asking, who was it?" A pause. Then, "A unit I can't fully name. Some people you may have heard of. Some instructors who were never public about what they did." Rebecca nodded slowly. She sat down on the edge of a training bench. "And the losses today, those were intentional." It was not quite a question. Olivia said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "You're mapping them," Rebecca said. "You're letting them demonstrate their habits so you can catalog them. You're studying this group like a mission briefing, and they have absolutely no idea." Olivia finally sat down across from her. She said, "I was told this group needed exposure to a different kind of training. Methods they haven't encountered before, techniques from outside their direct experience. But if I walk in on day one and demonstrate what I actually know, I don't learn anything about them, and they don't trust anything I show them because they'll feel ambushed rather than taught." Rebecca looked at her for a long time. "That is either the most disciplined approach I have ever heard," she said, "or it's going to blow up in your face badly enough that they'll send you home early." "I know," Olivia said. "How much longer were you planning to keep this up?" "Until the moment felt right." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that she would later describe as the one piece of advice in her career she was most proud of giving. "Stop hiding what you were trained to become," she said. "Not because they deserve it, because you didn't come here to be managed and tolerated. You came here to build something, and you cannot build anything from behind a mask." The words landed in Olivia's chest in a specific way. Not like an order, not like a reprimand, like something she already knew but had been waiting for permission to act on. She looked at Rebecca and said, "Day 5. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Give me until day 5, Olivia said. "I need to be sure." Rebecca stood up. She looked at the striking pad, at the sweat on Olivia's collar, at the total quiet that surrounded this woman at 10 o'clock at night in an auxiliary training room while the men who had dismissed her were sleeping. "Day 5, Rebecca said, and she walked out. What happened on days 3 and 4 was a particular kind of patience that very few people are capable of. Olivia continued to train publicly at a level that kept the group's opinion of her fixed in place. She lost when it served her to lose. She made mistakes that were real enough to feel authentic, but calibrated precisely enough that she was never in actual danger and never showed a gap in awareness she could not immediately close. She was in the most precise sense of the word performing. Not performing weakness exactly. Performing ordinariness. And it cost her something. Every time she held back when her instinct was to move, there was a kind of quiet violence in the restraint. Ryan Cole challenged her directly on day 4, not in a formal session, informally in front of 8 other candidates after a structured training block had ended and the instructors had stepped away. He stood across from her on the mat, arms crossed, and said, "Hayes, let's be honest with each other." She looked at him. "You're not keeping up," he said. "You're not embarrassing yourself, I'll give you that. But you're not keeping up, and I think you know it. So I want to ask you something, and I want a real answer. Why are you here, not what the paperwork says? What do you actually think you're going to contribute to this program?" The circle of candidates around them had gone very quiet. This was the moment, the social reckoning, the point where the group expected either a confrontation or a capitulation. Olivia looked at Cole for 3 seconds. Not a nervous pause, a deliberate one. Then she said, "I'm here to teach." Cole almost smiled, not cruelly, but with the specific kind of warmth that someone extends to a person they have decided to feel sorry for. "Teach what?" he said, "because from where I'm standing, we've spent 4 days watching you get schooled by guys who've been in this program for 2 months. You've been watching what I wanted you to watch," she said. The air changed. Cole's expression shifted. "Not much, but enough." "What does that mean?" She looked around the circle, every face turned toward her. She said, "It means I've been paying attention, and so far, you've all been very generous with information." Diaz said, "What information you've been losing?" "I've been learning," she said. "There's a difference." Cole stared at her. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite doubt but was adjacent to it. He was a good enough fighter to understand technique, and something about the way she said those words, not defensively, not anxiously, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already completed a calculation. The rest of the room was only beginning to aid him feel for just a moment like he might have been operating with incomplete information. He said, "Prove it." She said, "Not yet." He opened his mouth, closed it. She walked away. That night, she went back to the auxiliary room. Rebecca was not there. She did not need Rebecca to be there. She trained until midnight. She ran through every scenario she had cataloged, every habit, every blind spot, every pattern she had mapped across 4 days of watching people who believed they were watching her. She slept for 5 hours. Then she got up, ate breakfast alone, and waited for day 5 to arrive. The thing about Olivia Hayes that nobody at Fort Bragg understood, yet the thing that would take them years to fully comprehend, was not what she could do with her hands or her feet or her understanding of angles and timing and the physics of force. It was not her speed, though her speed was exceptional. It was not her technique, though her technique was the product of training so specific and so intensive that most of what she knew did not exist in any manual that these men had read. What nobody understood was the depth of her patience. She had been given the first real test of that patience at 21 years old in a circumstance she still did not discuss publicly and which remained protected under classification levels that most people in that training facility did not hold. She had been placed in a room with 4 evaluators who had been specifically tasked with breaking her down psychologically. Not because anyone wanted her to break, because the program she was entering required certainty that she would not break when it mattered, and the only way to gain that certainty was to put her in a room and try. They tried for 11 hours. They told her she was not good enough. They showed her evidence fabricated but convincing that she had been recommended for the program as a symbolic gesture rather than on merit. They applied every psychological lever that trained professionals apply in those rooms. She sat, she breathed, she waited. At the end of 11 hours, the lead evaluator had said something she still carried with her. He said, "The patience you have is not something we can teach. It is something you either have or you do not." We needed to know which one it was. She had it, and she had brought every ounce of it to Fort Bragg. Day 5 began at 6 in the morning. The training schedule called for a joint assessment block and then an evaluation review in the afternoon. But what happened in the late morning of day 5 was not on any schedule. It was the kind of thing that happens when a group of people have been building pressure for 4 days and the pressure finally finds an outlet. The combat field behind the main facility building. The lights coming on as the sun lowered at the end of the morning block. A ring of people who had over 4 days gone from dismissive to impatient to something that was not quite anger, but was looking for a way to express itself. 8 Marines stood at the edge of the arena. Not against her in anger, not in the way of people who wanted to hurt her. They wanted, in the language of that world, a demonstration. They wanted resolution to the question that had been hanging over that week like weather. They wanted to know once and for all what Commander Olivia Hayes was actually capable of. They stepped forward because they believed the answer was going to confirm what they had already decided. And she walked into that arena duffel bag, 4 days old record, still unreadable, silence still intact, and she looked at the 8 of them the way she had been trained to look at every situation that required her full engagement. Not with anger, not with arrogance, not with the need to prove anything to anyone who had not earned the right to evaluate her, but with the absolute focused, devastating clarity of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment and had spent 4 days making sure she would not waste it. The first man stepped in, and everything that had been held back over 5 days stopped being held back. She picked up every single item herself. Nobody helped. Nobody offered. She crouched down in that hallway, gathered her gear piece by piece, repacked the duffel bag with the same deliberate calm she had walked in with, and stood back up. The whole thing took maybe 90 seconds, and when she was done, she looked at the door to the barracks, walked back through it, and found an empty bunk in the corner of the room. She didn't say a word. That silence was the first thing that should have warned them. Cole watched her come back in and his jaw tightened. He had expected something, a complaint, tears, a phone call to a superior officer. He had expected the kind of reaction that would confirm what he already believed, that she was soft, that she was here by mistake, that this moment would be the thing that sent her packing before the real training even started. Instead, she put her bag under the bunk, sat down, and opened a field manual like nothing had happened. Cole looked at Diaz. Diaz looked at Trent. Nobody said anything. Stonewall, the big quiet one from Alabama who had not said more than 30 words since training started, watched her from across the room for a long moment. Then he looked at Cole with an expression that wasn't quite accusatory but wasn't quite neutral either. Cole caught it and looked away. That night, the temperature in the barracks dropped in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Day 3 started at 05:30 with a 2-mile conditioning run, followed by a technical review session in the main training hall. Whitmore stood at the front of the room with a whiteboard and a marker going through a breakdown of close-quarter engagement principles. He was good at this, clear, methodical drawing from decades of applied experience. The candidates took notes. They asked questions. The session had the rhythm of a room where people were genuinely learning. Whitmore pointed at a diagram he had drawn. The engagement window, he said, is the critical variable. Not strength, not size. The window. You control the window, you control the outcome. Somebody tell me what determines window control. Silence for 2 seconds. Then Cole raised his hand. Timing and positioning, he said. You have to be inside his rhythm before he knows you're moving. Correct, Whitmore said. What else? More silence. Olivia said quietly from the third row. Patience. The room shifted, not dramatically, but the word landed differently than anyone expected from her. Whitmore looked at her. His expression was the careful neutrality of a man deciding whether to engage. Explain that, he said. She said, timing and positioning are the mechanics, but the thing that makes them possible in a real engagement against a trained opponent is patience. The ability to wait for a specific window instead of creating one artificially. Artificial windows cost energy and create predictability. Real windows reveal themselves if you can resist the instinct to force the engagement. The room was quiet. Whitmore held her gaze for a moment. That's a reasonable point, he said in a tone that communicated exactly how much it cost him to say it. Then he turned back to the board. Cole leaned slightly toward Diaz and said just barely loud enough for the people immediately around him to hear, "She read that in a book somewhere." Diaz said nothing, but he was looking at Olivia with an expression that was slightly less certain than it had been the day before. The technical session broke into paired practice at 0800. The structure was the same as day 2, rotating partners, timed exchanges, instructors, observing and marking evaluation sheets. Olivia moved through 3 rotations. She lost 2-1-1 against a candidate named Torres, who was technically solid, but who had a specific defensive habit that she had cataloged on day 2 and was now able to exploit without appearing to do it deliberately. Torres looked surprised when she got inside his defense. He reset and came at her with more intensity. She let him take the second exchange, but the damage was done in a different way. Torres walked away from that pairing looking slightly uncertain in a way he had not looked before, like a man who had felt something he could not immediately explain. The third rotation put her against Cole. This was not accidental. Whitmore had structured the pairings, and Cole had specifically requested this matchup the night before. He wanted clarity. He wanted to watch her in a direct exchange against the best fighter in the group and see once and for all what the numbers said. They faced each other on the mat. Cole was controlled, professional. He was not trying to embarrass her. He was trying to evaluate her, which in some ways was harder to manage, because an evaluation was honest in a way that aggression was not. He moved in with a clean initial sequence. Fast, well-structured, technically excellent. She moved wrong. A half-second late in her weight shift, she went down, controlled the fall, came back up. Cole reset without celebration. He came again. She gave him another exchange close this time, competitive enough to make the loss feel earned rather than gifted, but still a loss. They reset a third time. And this time, Cole did something different. He feinted left, pulled the feint back slightly faster than he normally would, and watched her eyes. She didn't bite on the feint. Not even a little. Cole came out of that exchange with his expression unchanged, but something behind his eyes was doing a calculation he hadn't planned on doing. He said nothing after the session. He walked to the water station, filled his bottle, and stood with his back to the room for a moment longer than necessary. Stonewall came up beside him. "She didn't move on the feint," Stonewall said. "I know," Cole said. "That's not nothing." "I know," Cole said again. His voice was flat, but the flatness was doing a lot of work. That afternoon, during the unstructured hour between the technical session and the evening review, Rebecca Monroe found Olivia near the auxiliary building. Not in it. Outside it, sitting on a low concrete barrier in the gray afternoon light, eating an apple and reading the same field manual she had been carrying since day one. Rebecca sat down next to her without invitation. "Whitmore's going to recommend your early transfer at the end of this week if you don't show him something different," she said. Olivia turned a page. "I know. That doesn't concern you." "It concerns me," Olivia said, "but it doesn't change my timeline." Rebecca looked at her sideways. "Your timeline," she repeated. "You're still running this like an operation." "Because it is one. These are people, Hayes, not targets." Olivia looked up from the manual for the first time. "I know they're people," she said. "That's exactly why I'm doing it this way. If I walked in on day one and showed them everything, they would respect the skill and resent the person. What I'm building is different. I'm building the moment where they have to confront what they decided about me before they knew anything real. That confrontation is the lesson, not the technique, the confrontation." Rebecca stared at her. Then she said, "You've thought about this more than I realized." "I've had time," Olivia said. She took a bite of the apple. "Day 5, she said again. "I just need day 5. Rebecca stood up. "Cole is suspicious," she said. "He didn't bite on the feint, and he knows you didn't either. He's going to push harder before day 5. "I'm counting on it," Olivia said. Rebecca shook her head once, the slow headshake of someone who is simultaneously impressed and genuinely worried, and walked away. She was right about Cole pushing harder. She was right in a way that neither of them fully anticipated. Day 4 morning, 0600. The conditioning block had just ended, and the candidates were rotating through the equipment check stations before the technical session began. Cole walked directly to where Olivia was standing, in front of the full group, no pretext of casualness. This time just straight across the room with a specific destination. He stopped in front of her and said, "I want to talk to you." "All right," she said. "Not here," he said. "After the morning session." "The side mat." She looked at him. "What for?" "Because I have a question," he said, "and I want an honest answer. And I think the only place I'm going to get one is when it's just you and me and nobody's managing the conversation." Something passed across her face. Not alarm. Not calculation. Something closer to respect. Because what Cole was doing, the directness of it, the willingness to step outside the social game and ask for something real, told her something about him that the previous 3 days had not shown her as clearly. She said after the morning session, "Side mat." He nodded and walked away. The morning session was a full team engagement scenario, the kind of complex multi-variable exercise where the group was divided into opposing units, and the outcome depended on communication and coordination as much as individual skill. Olivia was placed on a team with Torres Diaz and 2 other candidates named Farrell and Kim. Cole led the opposing unit. The scenario was designed to last 40 minutes. It lasted 23 before Cole's team achieved the strategic objective. But something happened in minute 17 that Whitmore marked on his evaluation sheet and did not comment on until much later. Olivia's team had been pushed into a defensive position, outnumbered effectively at the critical point of the scenario. The team was scattered and the communication had broken down. Cole's unit was moving through the gap. In that moment, with her team falling apart around her, Olivia did not retreat. She did not panic. She made 3 very fast verbal calls to Torres and Diaz, repositioned them both in under 6 seconds, with instructions that were so precise and so clearly delivered that both men followed them without hesitation and created a defensive structure that held Cole's advance for 4 additional minutes before the scenario ended. They still lost, but Whitmore circled something on his sheet. After the session in the side room debrief, he said nothing about it directly. But as the candidates filed out, he held Torres back for 30 seconds and asked him one question. Who called in those repositions in the final phase? Torres said Hayes. Whitmore nodded, said nothing else, wrote something. The side mat at 1300 hours was empty except for Cole and Olivia. They stood on opposite sides of the mat, not in combat stance, just standing the way 2 people stand when they are about to have a real conversation, and neither of them is entirely sure how it starts. Cole crossed his arms. I want to know something, he said, and I want the real answer, not the answer you've been giving everyone else. Ask it, she said. Are you as good as I think you might be, he said, or am I reading something that isn't there? The question surprised her, not because it was unexpected, but because of how he framed it. He was not asking whether she was good. He was asking whether his own assessment, the growing uncertainty he had been sitting with since the feint she didn't bite on, was accurate. He was asking her to confirm or deny something he had arrived at himself. That was a different kind of honesty than she had seen from him. She said, why does it matter to you? He said, because if you're what I think you might be, and you've been hiding it, then everything that happened in this building over the last 4 days looks different. And I want to know if I've been operating on the wrong information. She looked at him for a long moment. You have been, she said. Cole's jaw tightened, not with anger, with something more complicated. He said, how much wrong? She said, enough. He uncrossed his arms. He put his hands on his hips and looked at the mat for a second. Then he looked back up at her and said, Cole. She looked at him. That night at the water station, he said, after our pairing, when you didn't move on the feint. I've been doing that feint for 6 years. I have never had anyone not move on it. Not once, he paused. That's not luck. That's not a coincidence. What is that? She said, that's seeing you. He was quiet. I've been watching your patterns since day 1, she said. Not just yours, everyone's. The feint telegraphs 0.2 of a second early in your left shoulder. It's almost invisible, but it's there, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Cole stared at her. The silence between them was a different kind of silence than the one that had existed between them before. Before the silence was dismissal. This silence was the recalibration of a man who was discovering that his map of a situation was wrong and was deciding what to do about it. He said 0.2 of a second. Give or take, she said. He nodded slowly. And you've been watching all of us like this? Yes. For 4 days? Yes. He looked away. He looked back. And then he said something that she had not expected from him at that point in the week. He said, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you come in on day 1 and just show us? She said, because you wouldn't have heard it. Not from me. Not on day 1. You needed to form your own opinion of me first, and then you needed to discover that the opinion was wrong. That's the only order in which this lesson actually lands. Cole stared at her, and for the first time since she had arrived at Fort Bragg, the look on his face was not skepticism or dismissal, or the measured tolerance of someone managing an unwanted variable. It was the look of a man who had just understood something real, something that shifted the ground under his feet in a way that was uncomfortable and clarifying at the same time. He said, that's a hell of a way to teach someone. She said, it's the only way that sticks. I was quiet again. Then he said, day 5. She looked at him. What about it? Something's going to happen on day 5, he said. It was not a question. He had read the week correctly, even if he had misread her. Whatever it is, I want to see it. She said, you will. He walked off the mat. She watched him go. And she knew from the way his shoulders were set, from the quality of his walk, that something fundamental had shifted in the man. He was not converted yet. He was not convinced. But the iron certainty that he had carried into this week had developed a crack. And cracks in the right material were not weakness. They were where the light eventually got in. That evening at dinner, the dynamic in the room was different. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone who wasn't paying close attention would have noticed. But the candidates who had been openly dismissive of her for 3 days were quieter. Cole sat at a different position at the table closer to where she usually sat alone, not next to her, but no longer on the opposite side of the room. Diaz caught her eye once and nodded the smallest acknowledgement, but genuine. Stonewall, who had said almost nothing to her all week, refilled his coffee, walked past her table, and set an extra packet of sugar down next to her cup without a word. She looked at it. She looked at his back as he walked away. That night, she went to the auxiliary room for the last time as a person. Nobody was watching carefully. She knew the parameters had changed. She knew Cole would think about their conversation. She knew Whitmore would keep evaluating. She knew that day 5 was 12 hours away. She trained hard, not to prepare. She was already prepared. She trained because the training itself was the thing she loved. The discipline of it, the way a body in motion at the highest level of its capacity, became something clarified, something precise, something that cut through the noise of every opinion and every assumption and every piece of wrong information and told the truth directly. At 11:15, she stopped. She stood in the center of the auxiliary room in the quiet, and she thought about the 11-hour room she had been in at 21 years old. She thought about the evaluator who had said patience was something you either had or you did not. She had known in that room that the test was a test. She had known the evidence was fabricated. She had sat there for 11 hours with that knowledge and had not moved, had not broken, had not tried to explain herself or argue against the information being presented. Because the test was not about whether she could disprove the fabricated evidence. The test was about whether she could hold herself still when everything around her was designed to make her move. She was still here, she had held still, and tomorrow she was going to stop holding still. At 0600 on day 5, Whitmore ran the standard morning block. Conditioning technical review paired drills. Olivia performed exactly as she had performed every previous morning. Controlled, competent, but not exceptional, giving the observers nothing new to work with. But there was a different quality to the room that morning. Something had circulated overnight that had not been a conversation exactly, more like a frequency, a shift in the atmosphere of the group that was difficult to source but impossible to ignore. The candidates who had been most vocal in their dismissal of her were slightly less vocal. Cole was watching her differently, not with hostility, with the concentrated attention of someone who was waiting for a specific thing to happen and wanted to be sure he saw it clearly when it did. Whitmore noticed the shift. He marked something on his sheet. The third time that week, he had marked something without commenting on it directly. The morning block ended at 10:30. The candidates had a 30-minute break before the afternoon evaluation session. That break was when it happened. Not on schedule, not organized by instructors. The way these things always happen in that world, organically, inevitably, because the pressure had been building for 5 days and the moment had to find its own release. 8 of the strongest candidates in the group gathered at the edge of the combat field. Cole was there, Diaz was there, Trent Webb Farrell, Stonewall, and 2 others named Reyes and Castillo. They were not there because Cole had organized them. They were there because the week had created a question that none of them could leave unanswered. Cole found Olivia near the equipment room. He stood in the doorway and said simply, "We're at the field." She looked at him. "Not an ambush," he said, "not a trap. 8 of us want to see what you've got. All at once if you're willing. Your call." She looked at him for 2 seconds. She said, "Give me 5 minutes." He nodded and walked back to the field. She stood alone in the equipment room. She breathed, not to calm herself. She was already calm. She breathed because this was the transition point, the moment between one phase and the next. And she had learned a long time ago to mark those moments deliberately, to arrive at them fully present, rather than stumbling into them, still carrying the weight of everything that came before. 5 days of silence. 5 days of holding back. 5 days of being dismissed and doubted and assessed incorrectly by people who had the ability to do better, but had not yet been given the reason to. She rolled her shoulders once. She walked out to the field. The 8 men stood in a loose ring at the edge of the arena. Whitmore was not there. Rebecca Monroe was not there. This was not sanctioned and everyone knew it. It existed in the unofficial space that every military training environment has, the space where the real evaluations happen, the ones that don't go on paperwork, but that everyone remembers. She walked into the center of the arena. She looked at the 8 of them. She did not look at them with contempt or with the desire to punish. She looked at them with the same focused clarity she had brought to every room she had ever walked into where someone had decided she did not belong. Cole said, "Whenever you are ready." She said nothing. She breathed once, and then she was done holding still. The first man who moved was Webb, not because he was the most aggressive, because he was the most experienced, and experience told him that in a multi-on-one situation, the worst thing you could do was wait. Waiting gave the single opponent time to choose their angle. Waiting surrendered the initiative. Webb had been in enough real situations to know that you take the initiative or you lose it, and you do not get it back for free. He came in fast and low, driving from his left leg closing distance in a way that had worked against every opponent he had faced in 6 years of competitive and operational training. His technique was clean, his timing was good, his commitment was total. He covered the distance in just under a second. He never completed the takedown. What happened in that second was something that the men watching from the edge of the arena would spend the next several weeks trying to describe to people who had not been there. The closest any of them came was Stonewall, who said it simply and said it right. She was already somewhere else when he got there. Not retreating, not evading in the conventional sense of moving backward or sideways out of range. She moved into the approach at an angle that Webb's momentum could not follow, used the force of his own drive to redirect him past her, and in the same continuous motion applied pressure to a joint in a way that put him on the ground before his nervous system had fully processed that the takedown had failed. He hit the mat hard. He tapped immediately, not because he panicked, because what she had applied was a lock that a trained fighter recognizes on contact, a hold that communicates clearly and without ambiguity that the next quarter second is the difference between discomfort and serious injury. Webb was too experienced to argue with that communication. The entire sequence took just over 3 seconds. The ring of men at the edge of the arena went very quiet. Not the quiet of shock, not yet. The quiet of people recalibrating. The quiet of people who had a model of what they were about to watch and had just seen the first data point that did not fit the model. Diaz and Trent moved together. This was instinct, not strategy. The instinct of fighters who had trained together long enough that their bodies coordinated without a verbal plan. They came from slightly different angles, not quite opposite, but spread enough to create a coverage problem for a single defender. It was a sound approach. Against most opponents, it would have worked. Olivia did not deal with them sequentially. She dealt with them as a single problem that happened to have 2 physical components. She read Diaz's angle and committed to it, completely used him as a moving obstacle between herself and Trent for the critical half-second it took to put Diaz off balance, then shifted to Trent before he could adjust his approach to account for the fact that Diaz was no longer where Trent's peripheral vision had tracked him. Trent went down. Diaz, still off balance, made a second attempt and caught an elbow redirect that sat him down hard. 2 more seconds, 3 men on the mat. Cole was watching with his arms loose at his sides and his weight slightly forward. He was not watching with the detached observation of a spectator. He was watching the way a fighter watches, processing, calculating, looking for the pattern that would give him something to work with. He had been doing this since Webb went down. He was doing it harder now. What he was seeing did not give him comfort. She was not fighting the way anyone in that ring had trained. She was not using the system they had all learned, the structured vocabulary of strikes and grapples and takedowns that formed the common language of their training. She was using something else, something that looked almost casual from the outside, almost conversational, like she was having a discussion with each opponent about physics and leverage and the specific geometry of their individual bodies, and the discussion kept ending the same way. Farrell moved next. He was smart about it. He did not commit the way Webb had committed. He feinted twice, genuine feints, not the telegraphed kind, and watched her response. She did not move on either feint. Farrell reset. He tried a third feint, this one with a partial weight commitment designed to make it harder to distinguish from a real approach. She still didn't move. He came for real on his 4th motion, and she was waiting for him in a way that felt to him in the moment deeply unfair. Like she had known which one was coming. He went down in a sequence that he would later describe as feeling like falling into something, rather than being put somewhere, like the ground had simply appeared under him from a direction he hadn't anticipated. He tapped. Cole said from the edge, "Reyes." Reyes went, Castillo went right behind him, a coordinated approach, both of them trained and fast and genuinely committed. Olivia handled the overlap between them with an economy of movement that was almost painful to watch, because the efficiency of it made clear how much she was not using, how much capacity she still had in reserve. She put Reyes down cleanly and redirected Castillo's momentum into a controlled fall that Castillo executed instinctively because his body understood before his mind did that the alternative was worse. 5 men on the mat, Stonewall still standing at the edge. Cole looked at Stonewall. Stonewall looked back at him. Something passed between them that was not words. Then Stonewall walked onto the mat. I was the biggest man in the group. Not just tall, he was built in the way of someone who had worked physically his entire life before the military ever got him, who had grown up on a farm in Alabama, doing the kind of daily labor that built a specific kind of functional strength that gyms could not replicate. He was also, in Cole's private assessment, the most naturally gifted fighter in the group after Cole himself. Stonewall did not fight with technique primarily. He fought with instinct and weight and the kind of patient aggression that was very difficult to manufacture because it came from a specific relationship with your own size that you either had or you did not. He stood in front of her and he did not rush. He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment the two of them held that stillness together. One person who had spent the whole week reading the room and one person who had spent the whole week mostly watching and who had seen in those 5 exchanges something that was reorganizing his understanding of what he was looking at. He said quietly just to her, "You've been doing this the whole time." It was not quite a question. She said yes. He nodded, just once, like he was confirming something he had already suspected for longer than he would admit. Then he moved. He was different from the others. She felt it immediately in the quality of his first approach. He was not trying to overpower her with speed or technical precision. He was trying to make her carry his weight. He was trying to get contact and use his size as an anchor to turn the engagement into something slow and grinding, where mass became the deciding variable. It was the smartest approach any of them had taken. She adjusted, not dramatically, fractionally. She changed the angle of engagement by 3 degrees and redirected his anchor attempt into a rotation that cost him his base without requiring her to absorb any of his weight directly. He recovered faster than she expected and came back with a second attempt that was different from the first, adapting it in real time. She adjusted again. He adapted again. For 11 seconds, they traded adjustments. The men on the mat who were recovering sat up and watched. The men still standing at the edge leaned forward. Nobody breathed loudly. This was not the same as the previous 5 exchanges. This was a conversation between 2 people who both spoke the language. Even if one of them spoke it at a level, the other was only beginning to perceive. Then she found his edge, the specific limit of his adaptability, the point where his instinct ran out and habit took over. She felt it the way a musician feels a note slightly off pitch, not a dramatic failure, a tiny deviation from precision. She moved on it without hesitation. Stonewall went down, not like the others, slowly in a controlled way because she gave him the option of a clean fall instead of a forced one, and he took it. He was a smart enough fighter to recognize the moment of inevitability and choose the dignified version of it. He sat on the mat and looked up at her. She looked back at him. He said still, just to her, "Okay," 1 word. And it contained more genuine respect than anything that had been said to her in 5 days at Fort Bragg. Cole was the last one standing. 7 men on the mat, the unofficial arena quiet, and Ryan Cole, who had walked into this week believing with complete confidence that he was the best thing in this building, walked onto the mat and stood in front of the woman he had dismissed on day 1 and looked at her with eyes that were doing the most complicated work they had done in a long time. He said, "You knew what I was going to do in our training sessions." "Yes," she said, "the whole time." "Yes. And you let me win." She said, "I let you demonstrate. There's a difference." His jaw moved. He looked at the mat. He looked back up at her. "And now," she said, "you can demonstrate again if you want, or we can stop here." I was quiet for a long moment. The men on the mat around them were watching. The men at the edge of the arena were watching. The decision Cole made in the next 5 seconds was going to define something not just about what happened on that field, but about who he was in a moment where his pride and his integrity were both pulling hard in different directions. He said, "Show me, not fight me, not prove it. Show me. She heard the difference. It mattered. She moved and she showed him. She moved through a sequence at maybe 60% of her actual speed, which was still fast enough to make the point. And she demonstrated on him with him the specific mechanics of 3 different engagement entries that his technique had left open in their training sessions. She showed him where the gap was in his left side defense. She showed him the tell in his shoulder before the feint. She showed him the window that opened for exactly 0.4 of a second after his dominant forward drive if the opponent knew to wait for it. She did not put him on the mat. She did not need to. When she stopped, he stood there with his hands at his sides and his breathing slightly elevated, and an expression on his face that had no name. She could have given it, but that she recognized. She had seen it before. She had seen it in the faces of people who had just had something rearranged, not broken, rearranged. Something that had been in the wrong place moved to the right place, and the discomfort of the movement was mixed with the relief of the correction. He said, 45 seconds. She looked at him. The other 7, he said, 45 seconds roughly. She said nothing. That's not possible, he said, but he said it like someone who had already accepted that it was. He turned and looked at the men recovering on the mat around him. He turned back to her, and then Ryan Cole, who had thrown her gear into the hallway on day 1 and laughed at her name in front of the full group, said the following words with 0 performance and 0 strategy and 0 awareness of how they would sound to anyone listening, which was what made them real. He said, I owe you an apology. She said, you owe yourself an honest question. He looked at her. What question? She said, why was the first thing you decided about me based on what I look like instead of what I know? The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. Cole held that question. You could see him holding it the way a man holds something heavy and unfamiliar. Something that his hands are not quite shaped for yet, but that he knows he needs to carry. He did not deflect. He did not explain. He just held it. Diaz, who had gotten to his feet and was standing 6 feet away, said quietly, same question for me. Trent said nothing, but he was looking at the ground and his jaw was working in the way of someone who is trying to process something they don't have language for yet. Stonewall, still sitting on the mat, said, I knew something was off. First day, the way she fell, I knew that wasn't a real loss. He looked at Cole. I should have said something. Cole looked at him. Why didn't you? Stonewall said, because I figured you'd already decided and I didn't want the argument. Cole absorbed that. The honesty of it clearly cost Stonewall something, and Cole was experienced enough to recognize what it meant when someone spent their own credibility to tell you a truth you didn't ask for. This was the moment, the actual moment before Whitmore found out, before it became official, before the story spread through the base, and took on the shape that stories take. When enough people tell them, this was the moment that mattered. 7 men on a field, 1 woman standing in the center of it, in a conversation happening in the aftermath of something physical that was actually about something else entirely. Reyes, who had been quiet, said, can you teach that, what you did on the entry against me? Can that be taught? She said, that's why I'm here. And then Whitmore arrived. He came from the direction of the main building, moving at the pace of someone who had been told something was happening and had decided to come see it for himself rather than wait for a report. He took in the scene. 7 men in various stages of recovery, Cole standing in front of Olivia with an expression he had never seen on Cole's face before. The quality of quiet in the group. He stopped at the edge of the arena. He looked at Olivia. He said, Hayes, explain this. She said, training exercise, sir. He looked at Cole. That's your assessment? Cole said, yes, sir. Whitmore looked at the men on the mat. He looked at Olivia. He was not a man who missed things, and he was not missing this. Something significant had happened. The specific shape of it was becoming clearer to him by the second. He had been wrong about this woman, not about individual details. Fundamentally, he had looked at her and decided what she was before he had any real information. And he had been wrong in a way that would require him to sit with for a while before he fully understood the dimensions of it. He said, in my office, 1400. He looked at Cole. You too. He walked away. The group stood in the quiet he left behind. Then Farrell let out a long breath and said, well, and that one word somehow contained everything that the last 45 seconds had produced. The disbelief, the recalibration, the beginning of something that was going to take a while to fully name. Webb, who was rotating his shoulder, carefully testing the joint she had compressed, looked at her and said, I didn't even see it. I still don't know what happened. She said, your drive is powerful. It's also completely committed. When you're in it, you're all the way in it. There's no adjustment available. He thought about that. So you just stepped out of the way. I stepped into your commitment, she said. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. The distinction was landing somewhere real in him. She could see it. This was what she had come here for. Not this field, not this morning, but this, the moment when something true moved from outside a person's understanding to inside it. Castillo said, is that a Navy technique? Where does that come from? She said, it comes from a lot of places. Some of it has names, some of it doesn't. Can we learn it? Castillo said. She looked at him. Then she looked around at the group, at Cole and Stonewall and Diaz and Trent and Webb and Farrell and Reyes and Castillo. 8 men who had decided on day one that she had nothing to offer them, standing in a circle around her asking. She said, that depends. Diaz said, on what? She said, on whether you can deal with being wrong. Nobody laughed. Nobody made a joke. Nobody deflected with the casual performance of toughness that is the habitual armor of people who have been in hard places and have learned to wear certainty like equipment. They just looked at her, and in every face she saw the same thing at different intensities. The beginning of the willingness to try. She said, 1400 Whitmore's office. After that, we'll talk about what's next. She walked off the mat. And this time when she walked away, nobody watched her go the way they had watched her arrive. They watched her the way you watch someone you have made the mistake of underestimating, with the specific attention of people who have decided they are not going to make that mistake again. Rebecca Monroe was waiting outside the main building. She had not been at the field. She had been told. She looked at Olivia with an expression that was trying very hard to stay neutral and not quite managing it. 1400 with Whitmore, Olivia said before Rebecca could ask. I heard, Rebecca said. How did it go? Olivia thought about Webb going down, about Stonewall saying okay, about Cole saying show me instead of fight me, about Diaz saying same question for me with the honest weight of a man paying a real cost. She said it went the way it needed to. Rebecca looked at her for a moment. Then she said something she had not planned to say, something that came from the 30 years of military training behind her and the specific clarity of having watched this whole week unfold from a position of understanding that no one else in the building had held. She said, your mentor would be proud. Olivia looked at her. Something moved across her face. Brief, real. The specific vulnerability that surfaces when someone says a true thing about a person who matters. She said, I know. Then she walked past Rebecca and into the building. The hallway was empty. She walked through it the same way she had walked through it 5 days ago, the same duffel bag, over the same shoulder, the same boots. Everything else was completely different. The air of the place had changed in relation to her. Not because she had done something to change herself, because she had waited long enough for the people around her to change their perception of reality. Her room was at the end of the hall. She went in, sat on the bunk, and was quiet for a while. She thought about Stonewall sitting on the mat, looking up at her and saying one word. Okay. She thought about Whitmore's face when he arrived at the edge of that arena and began to understand what he was looking at. She thought about Cole's question, not the one he had asked her, but the one she had given back to him. The one he was going to have to carry for a while before he found his way to the bottom of it. She sat there until 1350. Then she got up, straightened her uniform, and walked to Whitmore's office. Cole was already outside the door. They stood next to each other in the hallway without speaking for 30 seconds. Then Cole said, I need to ask you something. She looked at him. He said, before we go in there, before this becomes official and documented and whatever it's going to become, I need to ask you something personal. She said, ask it. He said, did you ever consider just leaving the first 2 days when it was the worst, when we were being what we were being? Did you ever think about walking out? She thought about the gear on the hallway floor. She thought about the silence at the dinner table and the conversations she had overheard and the deliberate, sustained weight of being dismissed by people who had not given themselves a real reason for the dismissal. She said no. He said, why not? She said, because I wasn't here for you. I was here for what you could become. Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, that's either the most patient thing I've ever heard someone say or the most arrogant. She said, it's both. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Whitmore's door opened. He stood in the doorway and looked at both of them. Then he said, "Come in," and stepped back to let them through. The office was small and direct the way. Whitmore was small and direct, every object in its place, and placed there for a reason. He sat behind his desk. They sat across from him. He looked at Olivia for a long moment, and then he said the thing that she had been waiting all week to hear him say, not because she needed his validation, but because what he said next was going to determine whether this week became something useful or became something wasted. He said, "Tell me who trained you." And that was when the real story finally began to come out. Whitmore's office was the kind of quiet that has weight to it, not comfortable quiet. The quiet of a room where something significant is about to be said, and everyone in it knows it. Olivia sat across from him with her hands relaxed in her lap and her posture straight but not rigid. The posture of someone who had been in rooms like this before and had learned that the way you hold your body when the pressure is highest tells the person across from you everything they need to know about whether you can be trusted. Cole sat beside her. He had not been asked to leave. Whitmore had looked at him when they walked in and made the calculation that whatever needed to be said was something Cole needed to hear. That decision alone told Olivia something important about Whitmore that the previous 5 days had not shown her clearly. He was wrong about people sometimes, but when the evidence changed, he changed with it. That was rarer than it should have been. Whitmore said it, again slower this time, like he was making sure the question landed exactly right. "Tell me who trained you." She said, "Some of it I can tell you, some of it I cannot." He leaned back slightly. "Then tell me the part you can." She said, "When I was 21, I was selected for an evaluation program that most people who went through it were never able to talk about publicly. The selection process alone took 4 months. Out of the group that started, 11 people finished. I was the only woman. The program itself ran for 2 years and covered close-quarter engagement methodology that had been developed and refined across 3 decades of applied operational use in environments that did not make official records." Whitmore was very still. "Who ran it?" She said, "A man named Carver. That's the only name he used with us. I have reason to believe it was not his real name. He had been an instructor for special operations units across multiple branches and multiple allied programs before he retired from active service. He was the most precise combat educator I have ever encountered. He did not teach technique the way technique is normally taught. He taught principles. He taught the underlying physics and psychology of engagement, and then let the technique emerge from the principles rather than the other way around," Verholm said from beside her very quietly. "That's what I saw on the mat." Whitmore looked at him. Cole said, "When she was working through the group, she wasn't running sequences. She was solving individual problems in real time. Every person got a different solution because every person presented a different problem. That's not how we train. We train patterns. She was doing something else." Whitmore absorbed that. He looked back at Olivia. "And the file," he said, "why is your file almost empty?" She said, "Because the work I've done since the program is not the kind of work that goes into accessible files. I've been attached to units operating at classification levels that don't produce public records. My combat history exists. It is documented. But the documentation is not something you can pull from a standard transfer request." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. He looked at his desk. Then he looked up at her and said something that she had not expected him to say, not because it was surprising in content, but because of the directness of it. Whitmore was not a man who said things he had not fully decided on, and the speed with which he said this told her how far his thinking had already moved. He said, "I misjudged you." She said, "Yes, sir." "Badly," he said. "Yes, sir." "And you knew it from day one." She said, "I knew it was likely from the moment I read the pre-briefing on the program. The profile of this group experienced high-performing, tightly bonded, strong existing hierarchy. Groups like this have predictable responses to outside additions who don't fit the established template. I expected what happened." Whitmore said, "And you let it happen." "I needed it to happen," she said. "What I'm here to teach cannot be received by people who think they already have the answer. The group needed to discover that their model was incomplete before they could be open to a different one." Cole said slowly, "So the whole week was a setup." She turned to look at him. "Not a setup," she said, "a precondition." "There's a difference." He thought about that. "You manipulated the situation." She said, I allowed the situation to reveal itself. Nobody in this group did anything that wasn't already in them to do. I didn't create the dismissal. I just didn't prevent it, because preventing it would have protected everyone from a lesson they needed. Cole sat with that. She could see him working through it, the discomfort of realizing that the week had been in a very specific way, a demonstration in which all of them had been both participants and subjects. It was not a comfortable realization. She had not expected it to be. Whitmore said, "The Navy sent you here specifically for this." "Yes, sir." "Not just to participate in the instructor development track." "The instructor development track is part of it," she said. "But the primary objective was cross-branch methodology transfer. The techniques Carver developed have been used in Navy Special Operations contexts for several years. The evaluation across multiple units has been consistently positive. The decision was made to begin introducing elements of the methodology to Marine Corps advanced training programs. My job is to demonstrate the approach, assess receptivity, and establish a foundation for a longer-term integration." Whitmore said, "And the way you chose to demonstrate it was calibrated to this specific group," she said. "A different group might have needed a different approach. This group needed to have their assumptions broken before they could receive new information. That required time, and it required allowing the assumptions to fully form so the breaking of them would be complete." Whitmore looked at her for a long time. The expression on his face was the expression of a man doing the hardest kind of internal work. Not the work of changing an opinion about a fact, but the work of changing an opinion about himself, about what his certainty had cost him, about what it had cost her. He said, "What happened on day one, the gear?" She said nothing. He said, "That was my failure as much as Cole's." Cole looked at the floor. Whitmore said, "I set the tone for how this group received you. By the time Cole did what he did, the permission had already been given. By me. By the way I spoke to you in front of the group. By what I communicated without saying directly." He paused. "That is not acceptable. That is not how this program operates. And it is not who I intend to be." The room was quiet. Cole said without looking up from the floor, "I threw her gear into the hallway." Whitmore said, "I know." "In front of everyone?" "I know." Cole looked up. He looked at Olivia. "There's no version of that where I was right," he said. "I was wrong before I knew anything about you. And then I kept being wrong, and I kept finding reasons to justify it, because the alternative was admitting I'd already decided, and the decision had nothing to do with evidence." He stopped. Then, "That's not the kind of man I want to be either." The silence after that was different from the silence before it. It had something in it, something that comes when people stop managing their presentation and start talking about what's actually true. Olivia said, "It's the kind of mistake that good people make when they haven't been shown a different way to look at something. That's not an excuse, but it is a reason, and it's exactly why I'm here." Whitmore straightened in his chair. He looked at her with the full undivided attention of someone who had just fundamentally reorganized his understanding of the situation and was ready to move forward in the new framework. "What do you need from me?" he said. She said, "Permission to run 3 sessions per week for the remainder of the course, structured differently from the current program. I'll submit the methodology framework in writing within 48 hours. I'll need access to the auxiliary training area, and I'll need the group to be told directly by you that participation is expected and that the evaluation criteria for the course will be updated to reflect what we cover." Whitmore said, "That's a significant change to the curriculum." "Yes, sir. The course director will have questions." "I have answers," she said. He looked at her. Something that was almost a smile moved across his face, brief and controlled but real. "I imagine you do," he said. He picked up his pen. "The sessions start Monday. Submit the framework by Sunday, 1800. She said, "Yes, sir." He looked at Cole. "You're going to be her training partner for the demonstration sessions." Cole looked up. "Sir, you're the best technical fighter in the group," Whitmore said. "If she's demonstrating methodology, she needs a partner who can show the full range of what the methodology addresses. That's you." He paused. "Unless you have an objection." Cole looked at Olivia. She looked back at him. He said, "No objection, sir." They walked out of Whitmore's office together. The hallway was empty. They stood outside the door for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have just come through something and are deciding what to do with where they've landed. Cole said, training partner. She said, should be interesting. He said, for the record, what you did on the mat this morning. The sequence you showed me the entry off my forward drive. I've been running that drive for 6 years and nobody has ever shown me that gap. She said, you close distance beautifully. The drive is genuinely excellent. But beauty at full commitment leaves a specific window on the recovery. You don't need to change the drive. You need to know the window exists so you can account for it. I thought about that. Can you teach someone to close that window? She said, I can teach you to know it's there. Knowing it's there changes everything about how you use the drive. You start making choices instead of running patterns. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said Monday. She said Monday. He walked down the hallway. She watched him go and thought about what Whitmore had said. That is not who I intend to be. She thought about how rare it was for a person in authority to say that. To not just correct the record, but to name the gap between who they were and who they intended to be in front of the person they had wronged, without a performance of shame designed to deflect the accountability rather than hold it. She thought it probably meant this was going to work. That evening, the dynamic in the barracks had shifted so completely that anyone walking in off the street would not have recognized it as the same room it had been 48 hours earlier. The candidates gathered after dinner in the common area, and for the first time since Olivia had arrived, she was not sitting alone at the edge of something. She was in the middle of it, not because anyone had made a formal announcement, because the mat had made the announcement and the common area was just catching up. Diaz pulled a chair up across from her and said, okay, I have to ask, the entry you used on me, the one where you used me as an obstacle between yourself and Trent, how long does it take to learn to read a two-person approach well enough to do that in real time? She said, depends on the person, depends on how willing you are to be wrong a lot before you get it right. Diaz said, what does being wrong look like in that context? She said, it looks like misjudging which person to commit to and getting caught in the gap. Getting caught in the gap hurts. But it teaches you the timing better than anything else I know. Trent from across the table. So you get hit. She said, you get hit. Then you understand exactly why you got hit, and you don't make that particular mistake again. Webb said, Carver, the man who trained you, is he still active? Is he accessible? She said, he's not accessible to most people. He chooses who he works with carefully, and the list is short. But what he taught me is accessible. That's the whole point. Stonewall, who had been listening from his chair without speaking, said, what's the hardest thing he taught you? She looked at him. Patience, she said, not patience as a virtue, patience as a weapon. The ability to wait longer than your opponent expects you to wait. To not move when everything in you is saying move. To hold the window open until the exact right moment instead of forcing it because the pressure of waiting has become unbearable. Stonewall nodded. That's a hard thing to teach. It's the hardest thing he taught me, she said. It took 18 months before I could do it under real pressure, before my body believed it instead of just my mind. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Farrell said, when you showed up on day one and Cole did what he did with the gear, what were you actually thinking? She looked at Farrell, then she looked around the table. I was thinking, she said, that this was going to be a longer week than I'd planned. Someone laughed. A real laugh, the kind that releases pressure. Then more people laughed, and the sound of it in that room after 5 days of tension and dismissal and the sustained low-grade hostility that had lived in every interaction was something close to relief. Cole, who had come in during the last part of the exchange and was leaning against the door frame, said, for what it's worth, what you said to Whitmore in there about the precondition, about needing the assumptions to form so the breaking of them would be complete. He paused. I've been thinking about that. She looked at him. He said, I don't fully like it. I want to be honest about that. The idea that we were being run through a lesson without knowing we were being run through it. Part of me is still processing whether that's manipulation or teaching. She said, that's an honest thing to say. He said, but the other part of me knows that if you had walked in on day one and shown us everything, I would have been respectful and I would have learned the technique. And I would have gone right back to believing that who I thought you were when you walked in was still basically accurate. The technique would have been separate from the person. A skill I could take without updating anything fundamental. He stopped. This way I can't do that. Whatever I learn in those sessions on Monday, I already know the person it's coming from is someone I was completely wrong about. I can't separate those two things, and I think that's what makes it actually land. The room was quiet. She said, "That's exactly it." He nodded. Then he pushed off the doorframe and went to get coffee. The conversation moved on. The room breathed differently, and Olivia sat in the middle of it and understood that the week had done what it was supposed to do. Not cleanly, not without moments that she would carry the weight of for longer than she would admit, but it had done it. What came next was the part she had been building toward the whole time. Monday morning arrived with the specific quality of a beginning, not a restart, a beginning. The training hall had been rearranged slightly, the furniture redistributed to create more open floor space. The observation positions shifted in a way that Whitmore had organized without comment, simply showing up at 0500 and moving things until they were right. The group assembled at 0600, all 9 candidates present, nobody late, nobody shuffling in with the resigned energy of someone going through a required motion. They came in with the focused, slightly wary attention of people who knew they were about to encounter something that was going to ask more of them than they expected. Olivia stood at the front of the room. Cole stood to her left, the training partner position. Whitmore stood at the back, evaluation sheet in hand. She looked at the group, 8 men who had dismissed her, and Stonewall, who had doubted her quietly, and all of them now sitting in the specific posture of people who had been genuinely surprised once and did not intend to be caught flat-footed again. She said, "I'm going to start with a question, and I want an honest answer, not a polished one." She paused. "How many of you have been in a real engagement, not a training session, not a controlled scenario, a real situation where the outcome was genuinely uncertain, and done something that surprised you, something your training didn't prepare you for, that you did anyway, that worked?" Silence for a moment. Then Stonewall raised his hand, Webb raised his hand, Cole raised his hand. After a beat, like the honesty of it took a moment to arrive. She said, "What was different about those moments?" Webb said, "You stop thinking about the technique. You just react." Trent said, "Everything slows down, or it feels like it does." Diaz said, "You're completely present. Nothing else exists." She nodded. "That state," she said, "is not an accident. It is not adrenaline. It is not luck. It is a trainable condition." Carver called it operational clarity. The state in which your training and your awareness and your instinct are fully integrated and running simultaneously without any one of them overriding the others. She paused. Most training systems develop each of those 3 things separately: technique training, awareness training, instinct through repetition. But they are trained separately, and they stay somewhat separate under pressure. When pressure spikes, one of the 3 usually takes over and the other 2 diminish. For most people, instinct takes over and technique and awareness drop. That's why trained fighters sometimes make elementary mistakes under maximum stress. The integration collapses. The room was very still. She said what Carver taught was integration from the beginning, not technique first and then awareness layered on top. Simultaneous development of all 3 in conditions that required them to work together from day one. It is harder. It takes longer to show measurable results. And it requires something from the person learning that standard technique training does not require. Cole said from beside her, "What does it require?" She looked at him. "The willingness to be in a state of not knowing for an extended period," she said. Most training systems give you the technique first because technique produces early measurable results, and early results feel like progress. This system withholds the framework longer. You are in the uncertainty for longer before the clarity arrives. That's uncomfortable for high performers. High performers are used to getting results. Being in a stage where results are not yet visible feels like failure. It is not failure, it is incubation, but you have to be willing to stay in it. Farrell said, "How long?" She said, "Longer than feels reasonable." He said, "That's not a number." She said, "No, it is not. Because the number is different for every person, and telling you a number in advance would give you a milestone that your mind would start working toward instead of staying fully present in the process. The milestone becomes the goal and the process becomes the obstacle. That's exactly backwards." Reyes said, "So you can't tell us when it's going to click?" She said, "I can tell you that it clicks. I can tell you that every person who has committed to the process fully has had the integration moment. I cannot tell you when yours will come, and I cannot help you hurry it by wanting it more. You can only be as present as possible in each session and trust that the accumulation of presence will produce the result. Castillo said, "That's a difficult thing to ask someone to trust." She said, "Yes, it is." She looked at him directly, which is why I spent the first 5 days of this week making sure you had a reason to trust the source before I asked you to trust the process. The room absorbed that. Cole made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's what the week was," he said, "not just breaking our assumptions, building credibility for this moment." She said both things simultaneously. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in the specific way of someone appreciating the architecture of something from the inside. "Carver taught you that too," he said. She said, "He taught me that the lesson is never just a lesson. The context in which the lesson is delivered is part of the lesson. You cannot separate them." Whitmore from the back of the room said quietly, "Begin." She looked at Cole. He stepped forward. They faced each other in the center of the room, and she began to show the group slowly and with full transparency what the first principle of the methodology looked like in practice. Not the finished product, the starting point, the specific quality of attention that Carver had called the ground state, the posture of awareness that preceded technique, the thing that had to be established before anything else could be built on it. She showed them how it felt different from combat readiness, how combat readiness was a state of anticipation, and the ground state was a state of reception, how anticipation closed off peripheral awareness and reception expanded it, how the body felt different in each state if you knew what to look for, how Cole's body felt different to her in this moment than it had felt on the mat on Saturday morning, because on Saturday he had been in anticipation, and right now working with her in demonstration, he was being asked to try the beginning of reception, and she could feel the shift in him even in the first 30 seconds. Cole said, "It feels like I'm doing less." She said, "You are doing less. Less anticipation, more presence." They feel similar from the outside and completely different from the inside. Webb said from the observer circle, "What's he actually doing differently?" She said, "His weight is 2% further back. His breathing rate dropped. His eye focus widened by approximately 15 degrees. Those three things together change everything about what information his nervous system is receiving and how fast it can respond to what it receives." Webb stared. 2%. She said, 2%. Try it. He shifted his weight back, fractionally. The person next to him, Diaz, looked at him and said, "You look different." "I feel different," Webb said. He sounded slightly amazed. "I feel like I can see more." She said, "You can. Your peripheral field just expanded. That's not a feeling, that's physiology." This was the moment, not the mat on Saturday, not the 45 seconds. This was the moment that the week had been building toward. 8 people in a room discovering that there was a dimension of their own capability that they had never been introduced to, and the discovery happening in their own bodies. Not in a lecture, not in a manual, but in the direct physical experience of a 2% shift in weight distribution. Stonewall in the back shifted his weight. Then he shifted it again. Then he looked at Olivia with an expression that was equal parts confusion and wonder and said, "That's real." She said, "That's real." The session ran for 90 minutes. By the end of it, nobody in the room looked the way they had looked at the beginning of it. Not because anything dramatic had happened, because something had started. The incubation Olivia had described, the period of uncertainty before the integration arrived, had begun for 8 men who had spent their careers being excellent at one thing and had just discovered there was another thing entirely waiting underneath it. Whitmore closed his evaluation sheet at the end of the session and looked at her across the room. She looked back at him. He gave her one nod, a small one, but a real one. The nod of a man who understood what he had just watched and was willing to say so without words, because the words were not adequate to the moment. After the session, as the group filtered out, Rebecca Monroe was waiting in the hallway outside. She had come in during the last 30 minutes and stood at the back. She waited until the last candidate had passed. Then she looked at Olivia and said, "Carver." Olivia said, "He'd hate that I'm talking about him." Rebecca said, "Probably," she paused. "He trained you for this specific assignment, didn't he? Not just the methodology, this exact moment, the week of allowing the dismissal, the mat on Saturday, The session today. He built this approach with you. Olivia said he built it with me over several conversations across 2 years after the program ended. We identified specific environments where the methodology needed a specific delivery structure. This was one of those environments. Rebecca said he knew this would work. Olivia said he said it would work if I was patient enough to let it. Rebecca looked at her. And were you patient enough? Olivia thought about the hallway floor, the gear scattered across the concrete, the sound of it hitting the wall, the deliberate choice to pick it up piece by piece and walk back through the door and sit down and open a manual. She said, I had to be. Rebecca said, did it cost you a pause? She said, yes. Rebecca nodded. Good, she said. It should have. The things that cost you are the things you don't forget. She walked away down the hallway. Olivia stood alone for a moment in the specific quiet of a place where something has just shifted permanently. Not dramatically, permanently. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself with noise, but that you know from the inside has changed the shape of everything that comes after it. She had come to Fort Bragg with a mission and a method and a name that nobody recognized and a file that nobody could read and a week that had been designed to be hard in exactly the way it had been hard. And she had come with something else, something that Carver had given her. Not in any formal session, but in a conversation they had one evening near the end of her second year with him, when she had asked him why he had chosen her for the program in the first place. He had said, because you already knew how to lose without losing yourself. That's the thing I can't teach. I can teach everything else, but that I cannot put into someone who doesn't already have it. She had been 23 when he said it. She was 27 now. And she had just spent 5 days demonstrating exactly what he meant by it in a building full of people who had tried very hard to make her lose herself and had discovered that there was no version of the pressure they had available that was sufficient for that task. She walked back down the hallway toward the training hall. There were 3 more sessions this week. There was a methodology framework due by Sunday at 1800. There was a group of 8 men who had started something in their bodies today that was going to take months to fully develop, and who were going to need guidance through the uncomfortable parts of that development, the parts where progress felt invisible and the instinct to revert to familiar patterns would be strong. There was work to do. She had always preferred that to the alternative. The methodology framework took her 11 hours to write, not because the content was difficult. She had carried the content in her body and her mind for 6 years. It was difficult because she had to translate something that lived in muscle memory and instinct and the accumulated weight of thousands of hours of practice into language that a military curriculum committee could evaluate, approve, and integrate into a formal program. She had to make the ineffable legible. She had to put words around things that Carver had always said were diminished by words and trust that the words were a door, not a ceiling. She submitted it at 17:52 on Sunday. 8 minutes before the deadline, Whitmore read it that evening. He called her at 0600 Monday morning before the training session before breakfast and said 4 words into the phone, "This is the real thing." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "The curriculum committee meets Thursday. I'm presenting this myself." She said, "I appreciate that, sir." He said, "Don't thank me. I owe you a debt I'm still calculating the size of." He paused. "Thursday. Be available." He hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she got up and went to work. The second week of sessions was different from the first in a way that was difficult to quantify but impossible to miss. The group came in differently, not just punctual, not just present, but engaged in a specific quality of readiness that she had not seen in them before. The weight shift that Webb had discovered at the end of the first session had apparently traveled through the group in the hours after because all of them came in on Wednesday already experimenting with it, already having conversations with each other about what it felt like and what it changed. Diaz pulled her aside before the session started and said, "I tried it last night, the ground state thing. I was just sitting in the common room and I tried shifting into it, and something happened that I want to ask you about." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I could hear the room differently, not louder, more accurately, like things that were happening at the edge of the room suddenly registered clearly instead of being background noise." I said, "What you're describing is the peripheral auditory field opening. When your visual field expands, your auditory field follows. Your nervous system stops prioritizing central focus and starts processing the full environment. He stared at her. That happens just from shifting my weight 2%. She said the weight shift is the entry point. What it actually does is change your neurological state. The body position and the mental state are linked more tightly than most people realize. Change the body and the mind follows. Carver spent 3 months just on that one principle before he let us touch technique. Diaz shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in the specific wonder of someone discovering that the territory is larger than the map they had been given. 3 months, he said. She said 3 months, and we were impatient for every day of it. Every single one of us was certain we were wasting time, that we should be doing something that looked more like fighting. She paused. On the day he finally introduced the first technical application, every person in the room understood it in 40 minutes. 40 minutes, because the foundation was completely solid. He used to say, build the ground first. Everything else is just weather. Diaz repeated it quietly to himself. Build the ground first. Everything else is just weather. She could see it landing, not as a concept, as a conviction. The Wednesday session ran 2 hours and went places she had not planned to go, which was the best sign she knew of that the group was genuinely in the process. When the learning is real, it outruns the curriculum. The questions get ahead of the answers, and you have to move faster than you plan to stay with where the group actually is, rather than where you expected them to be. Cole was the one who pushed it furthest. He was working the ground state impaired practice with Farrell, and he stopped mid-sequence and said, wait. He stepped back. Farrell looked at him. Cole said, I just felt the window. She looked at him from across the room. He said, your forward drive, the window you showed me. I felt it in what Farrell was doing. He has a version of the same thing. Different trigger, same window. She crossed the room. She looked at Farrell. She said, show me your entry. Farrell ran the entry sequence. She watched. Cole was right. Farrell had a window in his lateral shift that was structurally similar to the one in Cole's forwards drive. Different surface, same underlying geometry. She said, Cole, you found that through the ground state. He said, I wasn't looking for it. I was just present, and it appeared. The room had gone quiet around them, everyone watching. She said, that's the integration moment. Cole looked at her. That's it. That's the thing you said couldn't be hurried. She said, for that one application, yes. It doesn't mean it's complete. It means the door opened. Now you have to walk through it 1,000 more times before it stays open consistently under maximum pressure. She paused. But yes, that's it. Cole looked at Farrell, then he looked back at her. Something crossed his face that was almost overwhelming in its simplicity. It was not triumph, it was not pride. It was the expression of a man who had just understood something true about how his own mind worked and was trying to hold the understanding carefully because he knew how easily real things can be lost if you grab them too hard. He said, a week ago, I was convinced you had nothing to teach me. She said, I know. He said, I want you to know that I know how wrong that was. She said, I know that too. The Thursday curriculum committee meeting happened in a conference room that Olivia was not initially invited to attend. Whitmore had presented the framework himself as promised, and the committee had spent 90 minutes with it before Whitmore called her and said, they want to hear from you directly. Can you be here in 20 minutes? She said, I can be there in 10. She walked into the conference room and faced 7 senior officers and 2 civilian training consultants. They had the framework in front of them. They had read it. She could tell by the quality of their questions that most of them had read it carefully, and one of them, a colonel named Hargrove, who had the specific stillness of someone who had been in a very large number of important rooms, had read it multiple times. Hargrove said, without preamble, the integration methodology you're describing requires a fundamental restructuring of how we sequence skill development. That's not a small ask. She said, no, sir, it's not. He said, walk me through the evidence base. She walked him through it, 15 minutes. Precise, documented, sourced where sources were accessible and clearly noted where classification limited what she could share. She told them about the 11 people who had completed the original program and what their subsequent operational performance had shown. She told them about the 3 Navy units where elements of the methodology had been applied and the measured outcomes across 2 years of evaluation. She told them what the first week at Fort Bragg had produced in a group of 8 candidates who had come in with established high performance in the existing system. When she finished, Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You spent 5 days allowing this group to dismiss you in order to create the psychological precondition for receptivity. She said, yes, sir. He said, that required a significant personal cost. She said, yes, sir. He said, would you do it the same way again? She said, yes, with this group in this environment, with this specific objective. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Whitmore. Something passed between them that she could not fully read, but that had the quality of a settled decision. Hargrove said, Commander Hayes, the committee is going to approve a 12-week pilot program based on the framework you've submitted. You will lead the program. Whitmore will co-lead in an advisory capacity. We will evaluate at the 6-week mark and again at completion. If the outcomes data supports the methodology, we will discuss permanent integration. He paused. This is a significant opportunity. I expect you understand that. She said, I understand it, sir. He said, and I expect you understand that if it fails, the failure will be visible and the professional cost will be real. She said, I understand that too, sir. He nodded. Then we're done here. She walked out of that conference room and stood in the hallway and breathed. Not from relief, from the specific weight of a door opening that you have spent a long time working toward, and that is larger than you let yourself fully imagine until it is actually in front of you. Rebecca Munro was not in the hallway this time. Nobody was. She was alone with the moment, and she held it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she went back to work. The pilot program began the following Monday. 12 weeks, 3 sessions per week. The same 8 candidates plus 4 additional participants that Whitmore had selected from adjacent units people. He trusted to be in a genuine learning process and to handle the discomfort of the uncertainty phase without fracturing. 12 people in total, the largest group Olivia had worked with using the full methodology. The first 6 weeks were exactly as hard as she had told them they would be. Reyes hit a wall in week 3 where his performance in the technical applications actually declined measurably from where it had been at the start of the program. He came to her after a session where he had lost 4 consecutive exchanges to partners he had previously handled comfortably and said with the specific rawness of a high performer in an unfamiliar kind of struggle. I don't know what's happening. I feel like I'm getting worse. She said, you are getting worse. He looked at her. She said, temporarily, your nervous system is being reorganized. The patterns that produced your previous results are being disrupted so the new integration can be built in their place. You cannot build new structure without first creating space where the old structure was. The space feels like loss. It is not loss. It is construction. He said, how long? She said, I don't know. Carver told me the same thing at the same point in my process, and I asked him the same question, and he said, as long as it takes. I know that's not satisfying. Reyes said, it's not. She said, I know, stay in it. He looked at her with the eyes of someone deciding whether to trust something that felt unreasonable. Then he said, okay, and he went back to work. He broke through in week 5. The breakthrough happened in a live session in front of the full group, and it was not subtle. He was working a multi-opponent scenario with Castillo and Torres, and he entered the ground state, and something in him that had been resisting the integration stopped resisting. And the 3 things Carver had named technique, awareness, instinct, came together in a way that was visible to everyone in the room simultaneously. He handled the 3-opponent scenario with a fluency that made Castillo stop mid-sequence and say out loud, did you see that? Everyone had seen it. Reyes stood in the center of the scenario space with his breathing steady and his face holding the expression she recognized because she had worn it herself, the expression of someone who has just arrived somewhere they were told existed but did not fully believe in until the moment they stepped through the door. He looked at her. She said, there it is. He said, that's it. She said, that's it. He sat down on the mat, not because he was tired, because the moment required sitting, because some arrivals need to be honored by stillness. The group gathered around him in the quiet way of people who have all been in the same uncertain process, and one of them has just shown the rest that the destination is real. Cole crouched down next to him and said, what did it feel like? Reyes thought for a moment. Then he said, like I could see everything at once, and I knew what to do with all of it. Cole nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, I had mine last week. It's like that. Olivia watched the 2 of them from across the room. The man who had been the first to dismiss her and the man who had been struggling hardest with the process sitting on the mat together, talking about what it felt like when the thing she had been trying to give them finally arrived in their bodies. She felt something that she had learned over years of doing this work to receive without deflecting. Something that was not pride exactly, but that lived in the same neighborhood. The specific satisfaction of a teacher watching a student arrive somewhere real. Whitmore was standing beside her. He had been watching the exchange between Cole and Reyes. He said without looking at her, Carver built something. She said, he built a lot of things. Whitmore said, does he know what you're doing with it here? She said, he knows in general terms. The specific details of this program are mine. Whitmore said he'd approve. She said he would criticize at least 4 things I've done and then say the intent was right. Whitmore made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him. Brief, real, the laugh of a man who recognized a specific kind of mentor in what she had described, the kind who shows their approval through the precision of their critique. He said, I want to ask you something. She looked at him. He said, the first morning, when you arrived, I spoke to you in a way that communicated something I did not intend to communicate. She said, sir. He said, I intend to communicate it now. He paused. He turned to look at her directly. I was wrong about you, not about the details. Fundamentally, I looked at you and decided who you were before you had the opportunity to show me. That is a failure of the principle I have spent 22 years teaching other people to uphold. And I am telling you directly in the specific way a man tells another person something true that I am sorry for it. The hallway they were standing in was empty. The session had moved into partner work, and the sound of it came through the wall, the specific rhythm of people genuinely training. She looked at Whitmore and saw a man who had come all the way to this moment through the hard route, through having his assumptions broken in front of his own candidates, through sitting in an office and hearing a woman he had dismissed explain the depth of what she was carrying through 12 weeks of watching his group be transformed by something he had not known existed before she arrived. She said, I accept that, sir. And I want you to know that what you did when the evidence changed matters as much as the initial mistake. More maybe. A lot of people don't change when the evidence changes. You did. He held her gaze. Then he nodded once the way Stonewall had nodded on the mat after she put him down. A nod that contained more than it expressed. He went back into the session. She stood alone in the hallway for a moment. Then she went back in too. The 6-week evaluation happened on a Wednesday. Hargrove came himself. He did not send a representative. He sat in the back of the room with an evaluation sheet and watched 2 hours of the most advanced combat methodology session that had ever been formally conducted at Fort Bragg. And when it was over, he closed his sheet and said simply, continue. Then he said, I want to report on the 12-week outcomes within 2 weeks of completion, and I want you at the review personally. She said, yes, sir. He started to leave. Then he stopped and turned back and said something she had not expected. He said, my daughter is in the Navy. She's 24. She's good. She's going to be very good. He paused. I'm going to make sure she hears about this program. He walked out. Whitmore looked at Olivia. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. The weight of what Hargrove had just said settled in the room, and they let it. The final weeks of the program accelerated in the way that endings always accelerate, when the work is real and the people doing it know the time is limited. The group trained with an intensity that had nothing forced about it, the intensity of people who have discovered something they want more of and are aware that this particular structure, this room, this specific configuration of instructor and candidates and shared process will not exist in this form forever. Cole's transformation was the one people would talk about later, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the most visible. He had been the most resistant, and he had come the furthest, and the distance he had traveled was written in the way he moved, in the quality of his attention, in the specific thing that had replaced the iron certainty he had carried in his body on day 1 of the original week. The certainty was still there, but it was a different kind of certainty now. Not the certainty of someone who had decided in advance. The certainty of someone who had learned to stay present long enough to let the real answer arrive. He came to her in the final week after the last Tuesday session and stood in the training hall while the other candidates filed out and waited until they were alone. He said, I want to tell you something. She said, tell me. He said, I have been in this program since the military took me. I have done every course, every evaluation, every advanced track they've put in front of me. I have trained hard every year. I have been proud of what I built." He paused. "What you showed me in 12 weeks is more fundamental than anything I built in the years before it. I don't mean that as a critique of what I was before. I mean that what I am now has more capacity than what I was. And the difference is what you brought in here." She said, "The difference is what you were willing to do with what I brought in here. That's yours." He said, "You're going to do this somewhere else after this?" She said, "That's the plan." He said, "They're going to do what we did. They're going to dismiss you before they know what they're looking at." She said, "Probably." He said, "And you're going to let them?" She said, "If the situation requires it." He shook his head, not in criticism, in the specific wonder of someone who has fully understood something they found incomprehensible 3 months ago. "The patience it takes," he said, "to walk into a room full of people who have already decided you don't belong there and know that you do belong there and choose to wait." She said, "It's easier when you know what the waiting is for." He said, "What is it for?" She said, "It's for the moment when the people in the room stop arguing with what they see and start actually looking. You can't force that moment. You can only create the conditions for it and then wait." Cole was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you." She said, "Thank you for Cole on that mat in week 1 who said, 'Show me instead of fight me.' That was the choice that made everything after it possible." He looked at her. "You remember that?" She said, "I remember everything that matters." He nodded. Then he walked out. The 12-week evaluation report was submitted on the second Friday of the month following program completion. 37 pages, outcome data methodology documentation, candidate performance assessments, recommendations for integration, and a section at the end that she wrote and rewrote 4 times before she was satisfied with it. The section was titled simply, "What This Requires." It said that the methodology worked. It said the outcomes data supported permanent integration. It said that what made the methodology work was not the specific techniques, but the order of development and the willingness of the instructor to hold the uncertainty alongside the students rather than resolving it prematurely with answers that felt safe but that short-circuited the real process. And it said that the biggest obstacle to integration was not curriculum structure or scheduling or resource allocation. The biggest obstacle was the assumption held at every level of military training culture that a person's capability could be assessed accurately from surface information, from what they looked like, from where they came from how familiar their file was, from whether they fit the existing template of what excellence was supposed to look like. She wrote, "The methodology cannot be delivered by someone who has not confronted this assumption in themselves. The instructor must have been wrong about someone and must have allowed that wrongness to teach them something before they can ask a group of high performers to do the same. You cannot take people somewhere you have not been." Hargrove read that section 3 times. He underlined it. He wrote 1 word in the margin: "True." The pilot program became a permanent program. The curriculum was restructured. 3 other instructors were selected and put through a version of the foundational training before being certified to deliver elements of the methodology. Olivia supervised their development with the same patience she had applied to everything else. The patience Carver had identified in her at 21 as the thing he could not teach, the thing that was either already in a person or was not. The story of the week, the duffel bag in the hallway, in the 45 seconds on the mat, in the room where Webb said he could see more from 2% of weight shift traveled through Fort Bragg. The way stories travel in enclosed professional communities where people know each other and share space and carry the same kinds of investment in their work. It moved through the barracks and the training halls and the mess and the offices of people who had not been there and who heard it from people who had and who passed it on with the specific quality of care that people extend to a story they feel is important. It reached people who needed it. It reached young soldiers who had been dismissed before they were seen. It reached officers who recognized themselves in Whitmore's early behavior and who sat with that recognition in the private way of people making internal corrections that will not appear on any record, but that change the direction of daily choices in ways that accumulate over time. It reached a 22-year-old female Marine in a training facility 2 states away who heard a version of it from a sergeant who had heard it from someone who had been there, and who went home that night and wrote in her journal that she had decided to stop apologizing for what she was capable of and to let the room catch up. Olivia did not know about that journal. She never would. That was how it worked. The ripple traveled past what you could see, and you had to trust it was still moving. On her last day at Fort Bragg before the transfer back to her home unit, she went to the auxiliary training area one final time. The same space where Rebecca Monroe had found her at 10 o'clock on the first week working alone with no audience and no recognition and no guarantee that any of it was going to produce anything beyond her own continued readiness. She stood in the center of the space. She was quiet. She thought about Carver, about the specific quality of his stillness when he watched you train the way. He never imposed his attention, but simply directed it until you felt it the way you feel weather, without being able to name exactly when it started. She thought about what he had said when she asked him why he had chosen her. Because you already knew how to lose without losing yourself. She had carried that sentence for 6 years. She had tested it in 11 hours of fabricated evidence designed to break her. She had tested it in 5 days of deliberate dismissal in a building full of people who were certain they already knew what she was. She had tested it in 12 weeks of teaching people who had begun by throwing her gear into a hallway and had ended by sitting on a mat asking her what it felt like when the thing finally arrived. She stood in the auxiliary room and she understood fully for the first time what Carver had actually given her. Not the technique, not the methodology, not the 6 years of accumulated knowledge that she had translated into a 37-page report that was currently being read by people in offices she would never enter. What he had given her was the understanding that who you are under pressure is a choice, not always a conscious one, not always an easy one, but a choice, and the choosing repeated over time in rooms where nobody is watching, and in rooms where everyone is watching, and in hallways where your gear is on the floor, and in offices where generals are reading things you wrote, and in sessions where someone sits down on a mat and says, okay, with one word that contains a lifetime of recalibration, the choosing is the whole thing. The technique is just weather. She took one breath. She picked up her bag. She walked out of the auxiliary room and down the hallway and out the main door and did not look back. The recruit they laughed at became the instructor they followed. The woman they tried to erase became the foundation they built on. And the lesson she left behind in that building, not in the 37 pages, but in the bodies and the understanding of 12 people who had carried it forward into every room they entered after, was not about combat or technique or the specific geometry of engagement at all. It was about what happens when you stop deciding in advance and start actually looking. It was about the cost of certainty that has not been earned. And it was about one woman who walked into a building full of people who had already made up their minds, picked her gear up off a hallway floor without a word, and waited with the patience of someone who knew at the deepest level of knowing that the truth does not require permission to eventually be seen. She had always known it would be seen. She had just been willing to wait longer than anyone expected. That was everything. That was always everything.